For those who don't know, Scrivener is a tool for writers. It's part organizational tool, part word processor, and part publishing suite. If you start using it or already have, at some point you're going to want to share what you've written with others, whether that's a beta reader, an editor, an agent, or an end user, a reader of your material. And the way you do that is through Scrivener's compile feature. Compiling is a process that takes what Scrivener has under the hood, which is a bunch of formatted text files, and creates an external file of some sort. Early in your writing process, you'll want Word docs to share with others for comments on your manuscript. Later on, you might provide another Word doc or maybe a PDF for your editor or agent. If you're self-publishing a novel or a short story, you'll eventually want to get that into an ebook format. Compile helps with all of those things. In short, Scrivener's compile is a Swiss Army knife that allows you to get all your hard work into a format others can read. And it's necessarily complex. Compile needs to take whatever you've written in whatever structure you've put it in, and it needs to export it in a format and a file type that you specify, and there are over a dozen of those. Oh, and by the way, your needs for compile may change over time or on a project-by-project basis. Doing all of that in a reliable, flexible way is complex. As a result, the set of options presented to you during compile can seem daunting and confusing. I'm here to dispel that confusion. In this video, I'll explain how compile works, how to customize it to your needs, and show you examples of compiling Word docs, PDFs, and EPUBs, so you can see the process from beginning to end. Hi, I'm Brad Bollier, and I'm a full-time fantasy and science fiction author. I've published a dozen novels, more than 20 short stories, and I love talking about the craft of writing, which is why I started this channel, A Novel Approach. A Novel Approach is dedicated to helping you reach your writing goals by sharing inspiration, technique, and my 20+ years of experience in writing and publishing. We're going to get into the main content in just a second, but before we do, I wanted to let you know that this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by those of you who get value out of these instructional videos and spread the word. Maybe buy me a coffee on coffee.com, link in the description below, or buy my books at my website, quillings.com. Thanks so much for your continued support. It's because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. And for those of you who are new, please consider subscribing so you can keep up on all the latest tips, tricks, and deep dive techniques I'm adding on writing. Okay, so let's dive in. Scrivener's compile, what is it? As I mentioned, it's a way to produce formatted files from the scrivenings that you have within Scrivener. And why do you need it? Scrivener stores its files in rich text format files, RTF files, and you will have a need of exporting that to multiple different types of formats, from Word docs to PDFs to EPUBs and so on. There's over a dozen different types that you can choose from when you're exporting. So what are we going to cover? We'll talk about the scope of documents in the compile, which scrivenings are going to be compiled into that file. We'll talk about a simple compile, and I'll show you a compilation of a Courier simple Word document export just to get our feet wet. And then we'll talk about section types, formats, which contain section layouts, and the mappings between the section types and those layouts. Also, changing a format to suit your needs. We'll cover Courier to Palatino. And then with that understanding, I'll dive into the compilation process itself and how it works so you can really understand what's going on under the hood. We'll generate a Word doc, a PDF, and an EPUB at the end, so you can see different formats and how those are exported as well, and the options that you have for each. So let's start with the scope. The scope determines, as I mentioned, which scrivenings are going to be included in the compile. And there are various options provided. You can do the full manuscript. I'll show you how we can select just certain scrivenings, maybe the opening or the ending of your novel, for example. You can also specify search results, and finally, collections. Okay, so let's look at an example. I copied this from an existing project. It's complete, but I pared it down to just the opening bunch of chapters so the compiles go a little bit faster. Now, to start the compile, you can either go under File, Compile, and always remember there are keyboard shortcuts for almost everything, and so you can see that right here. So if you prefer to use that approach, that's available. Or on the main Scrivener window, in the upper bar, there's this compile for export or print. So you can just click that, and that will come up with the compile window. So the first thing of note in the window that comes up is this compile for. That pull down allows you to choose what format the file is going to be that's exported by Scrivener. And so let's change this to a Word doc. That's going to be my example initially. So now that we've changed the Word doc, note that the format's changed over on the left-hand side. And that's because compile is context sensitive. It has different formats for different types of exports. Also note that there are a bunch of Scrivener formats over on the left-hand side. These Scrivener formats are built in, and you'll get those as part of your Scrivener installation. My formats are formats that apply to any Scrivener project on this installation on this computer, and project formats apply to just this project. And so why would you want to use one or the other? Generally speaking, you'll use my formats, and I'll show you how to select that in a little bit. And that's because if you create a format, you usually want that to apply to all of the projects that you're working on. Project formats are for collaborative projects. So if you're going to be sending your project to somebody else to work on, and then maybe they'll send it back, if you're sharing it in some way, the format itself will be contained inside of the Scrivener project file. And so when you share that, either by sending or putting it on some shared drive in the cloud, they'll just pick it up. It'll just be part of that project when they open it. They don't have to separately pull in that format in some way. And you can export and import formats. So we've chosen the Word doc as the compile for. That's our compile type. Let's choose for now Courier, so Manuscript Courier. And again, this is the built-in format that Scrivener provided early on. Now that I've chosen the format, this central section shows any of the section layouts contained inside of that format. Also note that if I wanted to go and look at those section layouts, normally I could double click if it was one of my formats, but these are built-in formats. So if I double click on this, it brings up this little dialog that says the Manuscript Courier format cannot be edited because it is built into Scrivener. And so you could duplicate and edit, but I'm just going to save that for a little bit later. We're just choosing this one for now. Also note that the different section layouts here have the section types in the upper left. And so if you click on any of the section layouts, it will highlight on the right side any of the different scrivenings that use it. So this particular one section is only used by the title page. If I scroll down a bit, I see a chapter heading. Let me click on that one. And I see that all of these chapter headings now get highlighted. If I scroll further to scene and click that one, we see all of these sub chapters, these scenes, use that particular layout. So again, we're looking at in the upper left, the section type, and over here is our section type for our different scrivenings. And then this is the section layout. So this shows your mapping information. This is section type to section layout, and the section layouts are contained in the formats. We'll hit this again and again, so don't worry. And then on the right side, we get to the scope. So if I click this compile pull down here, I can see that there's the manuscript, which is the high-level folder that contains all of my scrivenings for this current project. And I could select any one of these as well, and it'll change the scope based on that selection. But let me just go back to manuscript. We're going to do the whole thing. But some of the other options are current selection. So let me just cancel out of here 1 second. Let's say I only wanted to send the opening chapters to a fellow writer to get their take on it. So I could select these 4 chapters and the scenes underneath. And now if I go to compile and I select current selection, that will take whatever I've selected in the binder. So current selection, and we see it just has those 4 chapters and the 4 scenes underneath them. Another option for the compile is the search results. So let me just cancel out of here again. We'll show that. So in a previous video, I covered the powerful search features. If I bring this search window, this little sub window open, and I'm looking for chapters that just contain Nira, Shiv's sister. And so it will do a search, or maybe Jasper, maybe fewer. And so it finds all of the ones that have Jasper mentioned, and you can change the scope for how it looks for that. I won't cover search again. You can look at that previous video to learn more about that. But whatever it finds, it'll have this list available. And then when I go to compile and I change this to search results, it'll change it to that list of things. And so again, you might want to pare this down before you compile, but you might be looking for certain characters, certain locations, and you want to compile those and read through it, what have you. There are limitless possibilities for why you might want to use search results, but it's there for you if you do. And then lastly, I mentioned collections. We covered collections in that same video as well. If you create collections, those can be static. You can just choose the ones that go into the collection, or they can be dynamic. Whatever type they are, you can use them in the scope for your compile. And again, all we're trying to do is to tell Scrivener which scrivenings you want to compile. And so let's say that I had this collection called Learning Magic, and I filled it dynamically or statically. It has some number of scrivenings in it. So I click on that and it shows just those. And whatever's in that collection will be included in the compile. Let's go back to the manuscript. And then we need to choose which format. So again, I'll choose that manuscript courier. It shows the different section layouts and the mappings. And then for now, let's just hit compile. So it's going to take those scrivenings and create a Word doc for me. For the time being, I'm just using this compile example document. I'm going to export this. I've already compiled it once, so you can ignore this. It's just saying, do you want to replace it? I'll say yes, and then it will compile that. And once it's done, that dialog will disappear, and you can go to that directory and look at that document. So we can see that it was just created. We can see it has my name in the header, the title of the document, and the page number, standard manuscript format. It also has courier double-spaced, which some publishers and agents want for the manuscripts they receive for consideration. And we can just scroll down. So I have the title here, my author name, and then we start with chapter 1. Now, let me flip back to Scrivener and just show you something. In this first scrivening, actually, I'll just click on the manuscript so we can open it up kind of in a similar sort of look. I mentioned in one of my previous videos that you shouldn't use chapter 1 and chapter 2 for the titles of your scrivenings. And this is why. When you compile, Scrivener is going to take care of that for you. And so you can see here, I don't start with chapter 1. It's also not in the folder that contains that scene. That description, that title is descriptive about the scene that it contains. And yet my resulting file has chapter 1 in it. So let's see where that comes from. Let's go back to compile. And we cannot look at this. Remember, when I tried to double click on that, it said it's a built-in one, you can't change it. And so now let's copy this so that we can look at it in detail and make some changes. So to do that, we can right click on this and we can say duplicate and edit format. You can also do a new format, but typically you're going to copy one of the existing ones. So you're not starting from scratch. You certainly can if you know what you're doing, but in the beginning, it's just easier to duplicate. So I'll go ahead and do that, duplicate and edit format. And it comes up with a new window that allows you to edit that newly created format. And this is how all of the formats look once you create them and can modify them. And so let's make a change. Let's make this Palatino my favorite font instead of Courier. So I'm just going to change this to Palatino. I'll get rid of the copy designation. And then this save to. You can save to either my formats or project formats. Again, my formats are global to all projects on this computer. Project formats will be specific to just this project. So in general, you're going to choose my formats, unless you have a certain need to share this with others. So I'll change that, and then I'll just hit save for now. So now if we look over on this side, I have my formats, manuscript, Palatino. That's the one that I just made. And if I double click on it, it will come up with that dialog. And this is what it looks like for any of the formats that you can edit. Now, note that this has a bunch of stuff on the left-hand side. It comes up with these section layouts first, and the section layouts define how the resulting file is going to look, how it's going to be formatted when it's compiled by Scrivener. The section layouts are listed on the right-hand side here under section layouts. And note, this is a common theme in Scrivener. Some of them are bolded and others are not. The bolded ones indicate that something is using them, and it's all based on the context. And in this case, it's which layouts are mapped to section types. And so we can see chapter heading is bolded, title section is bolded, and section text is bolded. So let me just jump back to the previous screen again. We have the format here, and then this center section has the section layouts that have been mapped. And the way that we map them is from this assign section layouts. Let's look at this quickly. All this is doing is for the given format that we've chosen, choosing section types and mapping them to section layouts. So we can see chapter heading is mapped to chapter heading. So same name for section type and section layout. Scene, meanwhile, is mapped to section text right here. And then section is mapped to titled section. So let's go back to the compile screen. Again, if I select any one of these, it will highlight on the right-hand side which ones actually use that. So let me pick scene, and we can see all the scenes have that. Let's go up to chapter heading, and we can see that all of the folders use chapter heading. Now, when I was first coming up with how I was going to approach compile, I was thinking maybe it would be better to show the scope on the left-hand side, because everything is flowing from there. But I can see why they went with this particular layout. The formats define what section layouts are available, what they're called, that sort of thing. And then you can map them, and you're going to be mapping them to whatever you've chosen in the scope. So I can see why the layout is this way. Now, let's go back to that format. We were going to change this to Palatino because it's Courier still. And so the way that we can do that is by going into the section layouts that are used and make sure they're all Palatino. So let's go to this chapter heading, and we can see we have chapter 1 in Courier. So I'm just going to click in here, and when I do, I see that this is Courier. I'm going to change that to Palatino. And then I'll go to the next used one. Again, it's bolded. Go here, I'll go to the title. I'll change that to Palatino. Now notice the title was treated separately from the body, the text itself. And so I have to click there separately. It's context sensitive. And so I'll change that to Palatino as well. And we can see all of the paragraphs below are changed. So it'll be using that over and over again as it compiles scrivenings of this type, where the section type matches titled section. And lastly, let's go to section text. And so again, it's Courier. I'll change it to Palatino. And so I'm done. I'm just going to say save. So now we have the format still selected on the left-hand side. And note that in the section layouts, they're all in Palatino at this point. So I can just scroll down and I can see they've changed. So if I compile again, same scope, and then I'll specify the same document, replace it again, and I'll go back, close this one, and then I'll open that same document. We can see the timestamp changed. And when I open it, I see the title page is now in Palatino. The chapters and everything within them are changed as well, the title of the chapters and then the body of the chapters. Now note that the heading did not change. So let's go back to Scrivener and open up compile, and we'll go into that format again. So I mentioned that the format has a bunch of different things that you're going to specify, not just section layouts, but also things like separators. If you have a chapter that has multiple scenes, the standard way to indicate that inside of a paperback book is a blank line, and then typically the next line, the actual start of a new scene, is not indented. You can also specify different styles, like what does the body look like? What do captions look like? What is heading 1, heading 2, the title? How are all those specified? There are different options for text layout, like the number of columns that you're going to have on a page, that sort of thing. The document title links, transformations, changing one thing to another from Scrivener to the compiled file. You can replace things, an occurrence of some word to something else in the compiled file, that sort of thing. You should familiarize yourself with all of these. I don't have time to go into every single one today, but let me jump down to page settings. I can see down here the header font and the footer font are Courier still. So if I click on these, I can go to recently used and I can pick Palatino 12, for example. So now that I've selected that, that's changed. I'll change this one as well. Close that, and they're both changed. And I'll save this again. So the format has changed. I'll compile one more time, export it. And when I open it, I should see that this has changed to Palatino, which I do. So that's an example of taking the existing built-in Scrivener formats and making a simple change to the font. And so we've covered that scope at this point, and now we've done a simple compile. And the basic steps for those are click compile, bring it up from the menu or that little icon, then choose the export type, the compile for, the resulting file type, basically. Select your format, select your scope, and click compile. And so this is what it's going to look like when you've made all your changes. Once you've finally gotten things how you like it for beta readers, for turn-ins, for EPUBs that you upload to Amazon or Kobo or what have you, it becomes like this, a simplified compile. But the tough part is getting there in the first place, which is what we're going to talk about coming up. So let me take a step back and talk about what's going on under the hood, just so you can kind of better understand what Scrivener is doing as it compiles. And hopefully that makes the purpose of the section types, the section layouts, and the formats more clear. So when you compile, you have a certain scope, which we just went over. That scope can be the full manuscript or some subset. In the end, compile is going to have one or more scrivenings to compile. And then we also have the format. So we've looked at formats, and they contain section layouts. They also contain things like the separators, the styles, the text layout, so on and so forth. Again, there's a dozen of these in total inside of that format. And then we have the layout assignment, that center section. It shows you what the mappings are, or you can change them by hitting that Assign Layouts button. And so that mapping basically dictates to Scrivener during a compile, given a certain section type, which section layout should I use? And then during the compile, Scrivener is going to get each of those scrivenings and feed it to the compilation process. And it's going to have all the metadata from the scrivenings, things like the title, the synopsis, the formatted text, the most important part, the section type that we mentioned, and other information. Compile actually has access to all of that stuff. You may or may not use it, but it can use it if you specify that in the section layouts. And then given that section type, it's going to do a lookup. You've mapped them, and now it's going to look up which section layout it should use. It will then pull that section layout from the format that you've chosen, along with all that other stuff. And then the last bit is to get it into the file. So it'll go through each of the scrivenings, and then given the compile for the file type, Word doc, PDF, EPUB, it will then create the resulting file and save it wherever you want to save it. So that's what the compilation process looks like. Okay, so let's dive into a change that does more than just change the font itself. We want something that makes us add new section types and do a mapping, so you can see how that works. So customized formats are going to have different section types that we specify outside of formats, then section layouts in those formats, and then we'll map them. We'll map section type to section layout, and that determines the final layout. Every scrivening has a section type, but section types don't do anything on their own. You need to tell Scrivener what to do with them. How? By editing those section layouts within the formats, and then mapping the section types to the section layouts. First, to create a custom section type, these are under project settings, and you can open them via project settings, or under section type edit. Then you'll click plus or add new section type, specify the name, and click OK. And then finally, you're going to assign those new section types to specific scrivenings. So let's go back to Scrivener and take a look at this. Now I'm looking at this first scrivening in the top here. If you go to this subpane in the inspector, again, your inspector might not be open. So if it isn't, go ahead and open it with this little I button there, and then go to the metadata subpane under that inspector. And you can see things like when it was created, when it was modified, whether or not it's included in the compile, and then the section type itself. So our use case here is going to be, I want to add a prologue and an epilogue. And the reason that those are different is because if I just compile this as is, we saw that this first scene will be compiled as chapter 1. I don't want that. I want this first scene to be a prologue and the end one to be an epilogue. So we'll see how we can do that. And in order to do that, we'll make a new custom section type. So again, I can click here and I can go to edit, and this brings up the project settings. I'm just going to cancel out of here and show you that you can do it from the other menu item as well. So under project settings. So Scrivener has Scrivener settings. If we look under Scrivener, it has settings, and those are specific to the Scrivener installation, that application. So it applies to all Scrivener projects, whereas the project settings apply only to this project. So if I open that up, the top one is section types. Again, these don't do anything on their own. We see the section types that currently exist. Not all of them are necessarily used. They could be, or they might not be. But I'll click the add button, and I'm going to call this prologue. Now, these will show up in the list in the order shown here. It's not alphabetical. So if I have some that are commonly used, I can move them to the top if I want. So maybe I just use prologue, scene, and chapter all the time. Maybe I don't want to delete these other ones, but I'll just put them at the top. And then I'll say, okay, my section types are created. Super easy. Now, if I go to this pull down, I can see that there's prologue, scene, and chapter at the top, just like I specified in that window. And so let's make this prologue. Now, one thing of note is that there is structure-based as well. If you want to look into that in more detail, you can go back to this edit. It'll bring up that same dialog, and see up here, there's default types by structure. And so you don't have to specify every single one. And in fact, I didn't for the ones that existed because they inherited it from this default types by structure. So if I click on that, I can change what section types are assigned based on the level of a given scrivening. If it's a folder, a top level folder, it'll get a part heading. If it's one folder, one level down or deeper, it will get maybe scene or chapter. I want my normal case to be chapter, so I'll change that. So that's a root folder and subfolders. And then there's root files and sub-level files as well. This is a touch confusing because these scrivenings, like this Shiv Breaks Hummingbird scene below that folder, is a file and it's a subfile. It's actually a level 1 file because it's 1 level deep. And so I could change that here if I wanted to something else. But right now it's section. So that's how it got that. I'm just going to leave that alone for the time being. Say OK. So I still have my prologue set up for this one. Now again, all I've done is created a new section type and assigned it to a scrivening. Compile won't do anything with it at this point because it doesn't know what to do. We haven't changed the format at this point. There's no section layout assigned to that. So let's go back to compile, and I have my format. I'm going to double click on that and I'll go to my section layouts. So I'd like the prologue to be similar to that chapter. So I'm just going to click there and I'll hit add, the plus button there, and I'm going to call this prologue. And now that is created, but not yet mapped to anything. And that's why it's not bolded. You can see it's just in that regular text, but it does have the title of the scrivening. Right now it's chapter 1 or what have you, and then the body of that scrivening as well. So let me go to title options, and we can see it's set to chapter and then this programmatic determination of which chapter compile is currently on. The Scrivener documentation has information on what all of these mean, like this $T, there's little macros. But for the time being, I'm just going to change this to prologue. Okay, so I've changed that from programmatic to just a specific string, prologue. And so now I'm going to say save. So the format's saved, but that prologue section type is not yet mapped to the section layout. So let me go to assign section layouts. And I can see now, before I had scene, chapter, and section, and now prologue is included. And so I'm going to scroll through here and look for my new prologue. So here it is. This is the section layout. Here's our section type. I'm just going to click that. And so now it's mapped. We have the light gray for the prologue and the light gray for the prologue section layout. And I'll say OK. So now if I click on, let's say this just chapter, we see all of these, but not the prologue. And you can see I've made a mistake here. I actually assigned the scene itself, not the chapter. So I'm going to change this one to structure-based. I'll change the chapter to prologue. That's bolded. Again, these ones are all inherited, but I specified this one. So it's not italics, and it's a bit bolder than the other font. So let me go to the prologue here again. If I click on this, it shows that it picks this chapter, not the scene below. And it's the first one. So let me go ahead and compile at this point. And then I'll go and open that document. So we have the same first page. And if I go down here, I can see I have the prologue. Now note that it's Courier. I forgot to change that while I was in there. But if I go back to Scrivener, go to compile, and if I bring that up again, go to my formatting, click in here, we can see again on the title, not on the body, we can see it's Courier. I'll just change that to Palatino, save, compile again, and I'll open it one more time. And so here we have our prologue and we have Palatino. Now there's some curious calibri in here as well. I'm not going to diagnose that at this point, but you can see also how this is a very iterative process. You're going to have certain things that you want to change about the format, and it's going to take a little bit of time to get there. You'll generate a document, you'll look at it, you'll see if it's like you like it. It probably won't be all the way there, and you just keep doing that. You'll go back into that format, change the section layouts or other parts of the format in general, and then save it and compile again and look. And you just go through that process over and over again. So let me do this a little bit faster with the epilogue, and we'll see how that works. So first I want my section type, so I'll go and I'll edit, and I'm going to add an epilogue. I'll just make that 4th in this list. I'll say OK, and then I'll go, let's just call this epilogue instead. And then I'm going to change the folder, not that scene, to epilogue. Okay, so I have my section type. Now I have to change the format. So I'll hit compile. I'll go back inside of the format, and then I'll create a new one. Go here, plus, we'll call this epilogue, and then I'll change that title option again. Before I make the same mistake, I'll go here. It did copy that one. So whichever one that you're currently focused on, when you hit that plus, it will copy. And so it picked that up already. So I didn't have to change that again, but you may have to change it if you forget or you copy from a different one. So I'll say save. And now that's in place, but it's not yet mapped. So I'll do assign section layout. I'll go to epilogue, and then there's a default as is, but I want to find my epilogue that I just created. So I'll click this. This is now highlighted in light gray, and so it's mapped. And I'll say OK. And so now in here, we can see the epilogue. We can see the prologue. I'll compile. And then let me go to the bottom of the document, and then I'll just scroll back up to find that first or the last chapter. And here we see we have an epilogue instead of whatever it was, chapter 10, 12, what have you. So just to summarize that, when you create a new format, you're really probably going to be copying an existing format and changing it. But when you do, you'll open that compile window, create new, or more likely copy an existing format. And those new formats, again, can be global or project specific, either my formats or project formats. Remember, we specified that. And you do that by that save to pull down. Then you modify the section layouts as you want. Do as much as you can. Again, it will probably be an iterative process where you get closer and closer and finally to your final format, how you want it to look. Then you'll modify any other settings in that format that you want. And then finally, you'll click save. And then as we saw, to map the section types to those section layouts, we're going to open the compile or just use it if we're already there. Select the format on the left side because that contains the section layouts. And then those section layouts will be available in the middle. And then again, the scope on the right-hand side. And then click Assign Section Layouts on the bottom. And then choose a layout for each section type. And finally, click OK. So a customized compilation process, which we just went through, looks more like this. We'll create those custom section types. So for example, prologue or epilogue or what have you. We'll specify section types for all scrivenings. So I assign those to the scrivenings I want to show up in that format. Again, some can be default values based on structure, which we saw in those project settings. Then we'll create a custom format, which we just went over. We'll modify that new format, including the section layouts. Then we'll map section types to section layouts. And finally, we'll compile. Now, again, this is kind of a one-time thing when you're first adjusting the format in some way. When you've done all this stuff, you don't have to do this every time. Once that format is to your liking, it becomes a simple compilation process. You just open the compile window, select your scope, format, hit compile, and you're done. So it gets easier over time as you get things like you like them in the resulting files. Now let's talk about compiling PDFs and EPUBs. So it follows the same process as the previous compiles, but one new subpane is added for the cover image settings. So you'll specify that cover image. You don't have to. That can be a default or none, I think. And then you'll compile. So let's see how that looks. Same document. I'll hit compile. And let me note a couple things at this point. So I'm still on Word doc type, and there are 4 subpanes up top here. So the scope is in the upper left. And let me just take a second here too. Checkboxes are part of the metadata for scrivenings as well. So if I check these, it will remember this on the next compile. So these top couple of chapters and scenes, I'll just hit cancel here. And let me go back to that. So I'll go to the first scene and I can see include in compile is unchecked. So that persists when you check those. And so you can use that on future compiles. If you're consistently sending the opening or the ending to a fellow writer to look at, you can use that over time. So if I go back and compile, I see that that's still that way. It remembered. So I'll just check those again. So this is scope. And then the next one over is some metadata about the project itself. So it has a title, it has the author, forename, surname. Some of this stuff can be used within the compile. So like the title was used in that header. When I compiled, I saw it up in the header. And keep in mind, whenever you see a question mark, you can click on that and get a little micro help on that particular entry or pull down or whatever it is. So here's an example of using this data inside of the compile. Again, they're all like in those angular brackets and then $1 and some string. And that tells Scrivener it's a macro of some sort and it's going to do a replacement on that. And then we have this gear icon. And so there's a bunch of different options that you can have for the compile. Again, these will persist. If you want someone to see the comments that you've added along the way, you can uncheck that and it will include those in the compile in the resulting Word doc or whatever. I'll just leave that for now because I don't usually have those. So you can look over those to get a feel for what sort of options are available and what you might want in your compiles. And then there are these transformations, some string that's found in these scrivenings with something else. I won't cover that now. Let's just go back and look at the PDF. So I'm going to go in here and select PDF. And now note there's one more. So there were 4 subpanes. Now there's 5 subpanes. So I'm going to click on that, and it's just the cover image. And you have some options for this as well. You can click on this and say no cover image, or it has a default one. You could have first image and front matter folder as well. I think I'm going to cover some of these optional things like front matter and back matter in a separate video. So let me just choose the default one. And so this just comes with a Scrivener project. So I'll include that for now. And then I'll say compile. Go into the same folder. I'll hit export. I already had one, so I replaced it. And then let me open it up. So I can see this PDF contains that cover image that we just specified. And then if I scroll down, it's going to look very similar. Of course, it's in PDF format, but it's going to look like that Word document because it's really using the same format. It's just in a different resultant file type. So we have the title page. We have the same stuff up top here. And then if I go down, I have the same header on each page. And then I have my prologue that I created and modified, and then the contents of that first scene, and on and on. This is a fairly long PDF at this point. So that's the compilation of a PDF. And then let's look at EPUBs real quick. So this follows, again, the same process as previous compiles, but 2 new subpanes are added. One for the cover image, one for the table of contents. And so we're going to specify that cover image and whichever table of contents settings we want, and then we'll click compile. So let's try that. So I'll click this compile for again, and I'll go down to EPUB 3 for our example. Note that this changes as well. The available formats is different than it just was. And again, that's because this is also context sensitive, this formats subpane, and it differentiates between ebooks and regular formatted files. And I believe that's because ebooks are treated a little bit differently than other file types. You don't specify how things look exactly in the EPUB. You give it the text and you do specify like italics and bold and things like that, but the size of the text and the format of the page is all dependent on the reader. And so that's the reader's job, whatever it is, either an app on a computer or a app on your phone or a dedicated reading device. That will dictate. You can specify the font sizes, the font types, the margins, et cetera, et cetera. And so again, we have those first 4 subpane types that we saw all throughout the compile process. We have the cover again. And so we have the same choices, no cover image, first one in the front matter, or just this basic cover. When you add new images to your binder in the Scrivener project, those will become available in here as well. It just picks up on the fact that a new image is in the binder and it adds that as a selection in this pull down. Okay, so for now, we're just going to choose cover again. You have some options here and title page name. And then there's the table of contents. And so you can use different options to specify what that table of contents will look like, act like in the resultant reader. So I'll just hit compile again, and I now have an EPUB. I'll go ahead and hit export, replace it. And so here's our EPUB just generated. And if I open this, I have some other examples that I ran before. So here is our file. Again, it's a little bit different. It's mostly the same, but a little bit different. So it'll have a table of contents that we generated with the prologue. And note that it's not quite right. We might have to go and make some tweaks. And then it has the titles that it used as it generated those chapters. And then finally the epilogue at the end. And then if I just page through here, it shows it like the e-reader that I'm using right now is supposed to. And if I went to a different e-reader, it would look different. As with all of these, you can change things like how it looks, the font that you're using, how large the font is, or how small the margins of the paper, so on and so forth. And so that is generating an EPUB. And so in theory, you could use this to upload to an e-commerce site like Amazon, Kobo, Smashwords, whatever. You would obviously want to go through a rigorous process of making sure, beyond the editing process, once everything's done, you want to make sure this looks good, that your cover is right, that the table of contents is right, that everything looks proper as you scroll through this, that sort of thing, before you upload to sell. But you can generate EPUBs, and I've done that for all of my ebooks that I sell on my website and Amazon and all those other sites, Kobo and so on and so forth. I generated them directly from Scrivener and then uploaded them. So you can absolutely use Scrivener and its compile features to generate those and sell your self-pub material. So just to wrap up, Scrivener is going to get a scope based on what you specify, 1 or more scrivening files. You'll have a format with section layouts and other information. You'll do that layout assignment, section type to section layout, and then it'll go through your Scrivenings and get the information it needs from the format and compile it for a certain type of resulting file, and then save that wherever you told it to save it. That is compile. It is complex, but again, it's necessarily complex. There's a lot of things that it has to do. I hope, though, that this helps to demystify compile a little bit for you. Easy peasy, right? Okay, not so easy, but I hope that breakdown makes compiling and modifying it to suit your needs easier to understand. If you have any specific needs for compile that I didn't cover in the video, let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to address them, or possibly even create a special video just to address that. And as always, if you found this talk useful, I hope you'll like and share with other writers and writing groups. I have a ton more videos I hope to tackle soon, so hit subscribe to be notified when those come out. I hope to see you all in the next one. Until then, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.